Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable. This is all incredibly interesting, and I have to say, the most charitable reading of all of this that I can give is you're dealing with a set of with a story that has now gone so deep that they can't even really see the extent to which it's confected.
Yes,
But,
you know what Trump should say? He should say, "Forgive them, America. They know not what they do."
Oh my gosh. All right. Now we really have this. I swore I would never compare Trump to Jesus. Oh boy. Hello, and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at The American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Klavan, features editor of The American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. And it's the skeleton shift today with just me and managing editor Seth Barron. Always a fun time, actually, when we get to do one of these two-handers. Seth, how are you doing this fine afternoon?
I'm doing great, Spencer. How are you?
I'm doing wonderfully as well, thank you. I'm scrolling through the PDF of the Washington Post PDF of Trump's indictment, just because I didn't really have enough indictment content in my life until we decided to revisit it yet again on this podcast. But we're going to do a spin on this news story. I will eat my hat if anybody else is doing this kind of segment, this kind of angle on the Trump indictment. The question that we are gathered here today to discuss is the Trump indictment, political process or Girardian scapegoat? And what we thought we would do, since this thing has been talked to death, we've investigated every possible angle of the indictment, what might happen, how it might affect the 2024 election. What we thought we'd do is try and ask which way of viewing this whole scenario is more accurate or closer to the reality. Are we looking at a run-of-the-mill working of the American political system, albeit in extraordinary circumstances with a former president and a future candidate for president coming under legal fire? Is this just the way our system kind of works to deal with these sorts of things and we're having our usual back and forth? Or are we in the midst of a kind of spiritual paroxysm of the kind described by the scholar and theologian René Girard, in which various different sides of a conflict are engaged in ever deeper acts of blame and ensnared in a kind of mimetic cycle whereby the only way that the thing can come to a close is with some sort of bloodletting? And in this case, I suppose Trump would be the object of our mimetic conflict. So
the idea is we're going to look at it from two angles. Like, one, this is just sort of like Watergate on steroids,
right?
But kind of normal. We've seen this before. Two, this is ritual murder.
Correct. These are your options.
Great.
And yes. And you may choose one, but choose wisely. And if your answer is kind of both, that is interesting too.
Mm-hmm.
I've been reading through this indictment just to see, whether the language struck me as particularly, shall we say, theological. And I have to say that right from the jump, of course, these legal documents are always written in a fairly dry tone, but there is something about the way that this whole thing is laid out that, this is an indictment about conspiracy to defraud the public. That's the formal charge. And we get to that on page 2. But page 1 is all this sort of roll up, like this drum roll leading up to the grand revelation. It's basically all about just kind of Trump being Trump. Despite having lost, the defendant was determined to remain in power. So for more than 2 months following Election Day on November 3rd, 2020, the defendant spread lies that there had been outcome determinative fraud in the election and that he had actually won. These claims were false, and the defendant knew they were false. Am I being paranoid to say that this is kind of hyper elevated language here?
No, I mean I think that's what it is,
Huh.
and I, I mean my sense is that Jack Smith. I mean, he has a difficult job because he has to establish that Trump is essentially like was plotting a coup, that he is a traitor of sorts, um, that he's like, I don't know, a would-be Napoleon on the march from from Elba. But at the same time, he can't. He's not charging him with insurrection. He's not charging him with sedition. So it's all based on this idea that, uh, I mean, apparently fraud at the federal level, like fraud against the United States, is always strictly a financial crime. Like that's the way the Supreme Court apparently
Hmm.
determined it years ago. So it's a very tenuous it's a very tenuous charge.
Yeah,
And
like
when I,
what kind of money is he supposed to have cheated them out of?
right,
What
no,
windfall of cash comes in when the votes are counted in the election? Not this is a
yes,
different, yeah.
and of if any speech is protected, it's political speech. So it's a weird thing. And I've seen some, and like the New York Times had an analysis of Jack Smith's strategy, and it kind of reflects this odd paradox because they say that he's been very clever in targeting it so narrowly.
Right, I saw that too. Yeah, that this is like somehow supposed to be just carefully carved out in just the way to isolate Trump's behavior only and not, for instance, to put you or me in danger
Yeah,
of legal charges should we speculate about the 2020 election.
but at the same time, okay, well, is it really surgically tailored narrowly, or is it just really thin gruel and just totally vaporous?
Yeah, well, it feels like what they want to charge him for is just like all of January 6th, right? Like the real accusation against Trump is that he is associated with this, admittedly, I think, rather traumatic day in our history. But it's kind of not worked to pin him with somehow like inciting the riot. None of that has really fallen through. He did not tell people to go and break into the Capitol building. And so they've had to, like, as you say, land on this sort of underwhelming set of charges for the scale, the like emotional scope of what they're going for and what the people who despise Trump really want to see him answer for. Because I mean, that's what makes me feel like there's like this profoundly symbolic and kind of ritualistic dimension to this charge. Because the other interesting thing about this whole investigation, this whole accusation is, if the idea is that Trump is a kind of demagogue, strongman figure that just wants to undermine our constitutional order, then the very premise of bringing an indictment against him kind of undermines that idea. Like, if you really thought that he was the wild man who would answer to no law and no order, then why would you bother charging him legally and putting him in front of a jury like that? It seems as if, the whole idea that he would answer to whatever the outcome of this case is sort of belies the attempt to say that he's some sort of, villainous, constitutional maniac.
Well, I mean, that's been the question the whole time throughout his entire presidency. What kind of like tyrannical demagogic dictator just bends the knee because a district court judge in Hawaii issues a nationwide injunction against what he wants to do.
Huh.
So that always seemed like there always seemed to be a major split, a kind of, I mean, I don't want to be over the top, but it did reflect a kind of psychosis, I think, in the Democrat mind,
Right.
that they had to just keep accusing Trump of doing all the things that they had done, which I think gets to the Girardian angle.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, this was going to be one of my questions because in the Girardian scheme, you have to have like there has to be kind of two sides to the coin, right? There has to be the person who's being accused, but then there also have to be the people who are sinning, who are laying the sins upon him. I was kind of wondering, like, what's the psychology there? You think it's that all the stuff that Trump is supposed to be doing is what the like sort of deep state is maneuvering to do behind the scenes and refuses to acknowledge about itself?
Absolutely.
Hmm.
I mean, even down to think about the accusations of sexual assault. Now, I don't want to say that, Trump has been the an idealized portrait of a family man.
A sort of Arthurian chivalric figure, if you
Right.
like. You
No,
know?
no, no. And I'm sure his personal, mores and whatnot are probably somewhat louche by the standards of, say, like, I don't know, the Missouri Synod Lutherans. But he is he really that much worse than, say, Bill Clinton, who has similarly been accused of, like, very plausibly, of rape. Certain, it was proven that he sexually abused an intern in his office,
Right.
and I feel like a lot of it has, that was never actually dealt with.
Hmm.
The Democrats never were able, and all of the Hillaristas, like the women who were the most fanatic about electing Hillary back to the 90s, these are the same women who have been in the forefront of Me Too, of equal pay, all of that stuff.
Hmm.
And they were never able to assimilate the fact that their hero, Bill Clinton, was, this, was really nasty on a sexual level. So I think they carried all of that over and dumped it on Trump. All of the graft, the evident, like Hillary Clinton's brother working in Central Asia to corner the walnut market, like all of these crazy foreign schemes that the Clintons and the Bidens have always been up to.
Yeah.
Putting all of that on Trump. So, those are the sort of obvious examples of projection. I think it goes deeper.
Right. I mean, there is the kind of more diffuse, but nevertheless, I think important element of, modern vanguard leftism, which is that it is sort of inherently sexually rapacious, that like it exists in part to tear down the sort of boundaries of propriety around sexual relations. And so when this guy like comes up and there's an element of this always that I've sort of always wondered whether part of the thing about Trump isn't that, oh, he's so innocent and they're, accusing him of all these imaginary evils, so much as that his temperament is so like brash and over the top that he has no instinct to like dissemble about being a total, lout, essentially. Like all of these people, as far as I'm concerned, Clinton, Obama, all of these, both of the Clintons, Obama, every Biden, they're all kind of two-bit gangsters, but they pay this kind of hypocritical flattery to some idea of like the genteel politics of yesteryear,
Right.
where Obama's got a great crease in his pants and he's so well spoken, and so that kind of makes us look the other way about his associations with like militant, angry, anti-American Black nationalists and all this other stuff. Whereas Trump is just out here kind of like saying these often quite alarming and appalling things because he has no interest. Like, he's sort of an Israelite in whom there is no deceit, sort of.
Mm-hmm. Well, it is an interesting question. And I wonder, I've always thought that there's an essential divide in American political history is between, now I haven't really worked this out entirely, and it's not entirely my thesis, that the big divide is between the good whites and the bad whites.
Okay.
And you can put this back, probably to the days of the Puritans, who were the good whites. And then going forward, you had the Scots-Irish. They were kind of the bad whites. And you see how this plays out with the abolitionists, and then the segregation, the slave class, and even the slave class, like even among the slave class, like had their own bad whites, namely, again, the Scots-Irish.
Yeah,
I mean, I think
basically just exclusively. You're just talking about Irish people here, Seth. just come out with it. The Italians,
not entirely. Yeah, I mean, but it's almost like, so just from this perspective, or look at the whole BLM thing, which has clearly been a weird charade where, right-thinking white people get up and pronounce the sin of racism, but you don't really. It's not like they really believe that they've been racist. They're saying the other white people have been racist.
Yeah.
So I'm like, for instance, a few years ago, Princeton came out and said, we are guilty of systemic racism. So, I wrote a piece saying, okay, well, if that's true, I think actually the Trump Attorney General at the time, I can't remember who it was at the time, did say, all right, well, let's start an investigation.
Yeah,
like, they did. Okay, maybe we should take away all of your funding. If you're really systemically racist, I guess we should, maybe you should shut down. Because they didn't mean it, obviously. Right. So anyway, this is a long way of getting to the point that the idea of the genteel statesman is always a lie. And so in a sense, they've pushed the image of the populist lout, which, Trump has embraced to a certain degree.
Yeah.
But they've really, I think, oversold it, that, that he's literally a beast, that he literally just watches the Gorilla Channel, and he literally cannot read, and that he doesn't know one country from another. All these things that they say about him. I mean, the guy's a billionaire. He's been traveling the world for decades. I'm sure he knows where countries are and so forth.
He has located nations on maps. Well, I have to say, before you launched into your venomous anti-Irish hate screed, showing your true colors.
No. I consider myself on their side.
You're pro-Irish. You're one of the one of the man of the people. Well,
that's me.
Yeah, I mean, your talk of the Puritans kind of did put me in mind of, again, not uttering some totally original thought here, but there was always from even like before the days of the Constitution, I think there was this strong sense in foundational American life that there was going to be kind of the machinery of politics, and then there was going to be the fuel or the soul of the nation, which was its like religious morality, and there was going to be a kind of operating system of religious codes that taught people how to behave and what actual virtues to incorporate into their private lives. And then you were sort of free to admit, in some sense, that politicians were the scum of the earth. Like they were all these kind of grifters and con men, and generally anybody that would want office was the last person you would want to put into office. I mean, that goes right back to like the kind of Washingtonian Cincinnatus myth that the guy that doesn't want office is the one that you respect and value and like. And in order to kind of hold those two things in your head, you do have to have this kind of strong national consensus about, what makes a good white or a good anybody, like what makes somebody virtuous. And there people have disputed and argued about that. But once you lose, a basic kind of religious core, then you have to pretend like your politics are the seat of virtue. Like then you have to offload all of that religious and moral theology onto your debates about who's going to be the president for the next 4 years and your debates about who you're going to vote for. And so politics takes on this intensely religious character. I mean, G.K. Chesterton said this about the Soviet Union, that they had this idea that religion is the opiate of the masses, but religion's actually the only like system that can kind of compete with politics as a place for people to put all of their emotional commitment to the moral universe. And once that's gone or it's weakened or dissolved, then we do start to like read into our political disputes these cataclysmic theological struggles. And we end up, not just saying, oh, this guy's kind of a sleazebag and I don't like his policies, but this guy is, the threat to the very soul of our nation. And he must be, made an example of and put on trial and ultimately destroyed.
Sure. There was kind of an interesting little example of this that I saw the other day, where this ex-FBI official, this guy Michael McGonigal. Now, this is the sort of story that, if it had happened under Trump, it would be just massively. Everyone would know about it. Okay, This guy was the head of counterintelligence for the FBI in the New York City office, from like 2012 to 2018 or so. I gather he was rather involved in the investigations of Trump. So he's this sort of guy, like a real deep state swamp creature.
Sure.
Okay, well, now he's apparently pleading guilty to charges of having worked for a big Russian oligarch.
Oh my gosh! Yeah, right. Okay, you sent this to us.
Yeah. And for misleading the FBI about his contacts with foreign nationals and foreign travel, creating a conflict of interest. Okay, so it seems like, this comes back to the old thing, like Trump saying to Biden, like, I don't work for the Russians. I never took money from Russians. You take money from Russians. Yeah. Your son works for a Ukrainian oil company, works for these Chinese companies. So, it's a tu quoque type thing. But here's the funny thing. So this guy McGonigal, all right, he's obviously some sleaze. But then the New Republic had this crazy article, which just cracked me up so bad, by one of these experts on Trump and Russia and all that. And he has this article. Did the FBI's Charles McGonigal help throw the 2016 election to Trump? This guy, Craig Unger. So his argument is like, it's so well established that Trump is a Russian asset. So why was the FBI so weak on going after Trump? The FBI must also be Russian assets. So
I love it.
McGonigal is clearly a Russian spy who was assisting Trump. So basically, he's saying that the FBI is also captured, and that's why the FBI has been so, timid and so tepid in its investigation. It's this type of thing where the more you look through this prism of Trump's manifest guilt, right, the more it captures everybody.
He's so Russian. He even turned us Russian. I'm turning Russian right now. Yeah, right. It is amazing.
No, it's really funny. Like, and this guy is nuts. He says, like, look, why is it that I've known all along? Let me just read it for a second. How is it possible that I knew all sorts of stuff about Donald Trump and the FBI didn't seem to have a clue? Or if they did, why weren't they doing anything about it? Specifically, I knew that starting in 1980, an alleged spotter agent for the KGB began cultivating Trump as a new asset for Soviet intelligence. And then it goes on and on. But, I've seen people talk about Trump's Russian ties back to the 80s. I've never seen 1980. So basically he's saying that like 40 years ahead of time, the KGB was plotting to put Trump in the White House.
We will plant him in American movie Home Alone 2. Win over people's hearts.
The least likely person. So, this is the kind of, it's like reading if some like fevered early John Bircher type was saying, yes, in 1912, Ike was approached by Trotsky And
Mhm.
Eisenhower at that point became an agent of world communism. You know, it's that type of thing.
I mean, that is truly amazing, and it speaks to, as since we're in this whole conversation about like the double vision of the political process versus the spiritual cataclysm. And it sort of sounds like we're saying, you know, that the Girardian process is kind of working itself out through this in political this thing that's masquerading as a political battle. And one way that that strikes me as true is there's this whole thing about mens rea, right? When you make an accusation like the one that Smith is making of Trump, you have to really establish not just what he did, but what he thought he was doing and what he intended to do. So that's the whole point of that line. You know, these claims were false. The defendant knew they were false. And you actually have to go like one step further than that and say he knew they were all false. And his reason for putting this forward was to engineer a conspiracy.
Yes.
And right. And this fever dream that you are describing, it's like the mens rea of it all depends on this absolutely whack job theory of mind where you have to impute to these people, to your opponents, an incredibly elaborate, devious, sinister, and long-standing set of plots. You know, I'm even just looking at like, you know, he has all these co-conspirators here, one of whom I think that our friend John Eastman has already talked about this, so we can talk about co-conspirator two, an attorney who devised and attempted to implement a strategy to leverage the vice president's ceremonial role, overseeing the certification proceeding to obstruct the certification of the presidential election. Now, you can have any number of arguments with John Eastman about whether he was right. And in fact, we've hosted a lot of those arguments in the Claremont review of books. But the one thing that nobody could plausibly claim, even for a second, is that Eastman is somewhere rubbing his hands together and saying, I know what I'll do. I'll thwart the will of the American people by making up lies. Like that's the level of that's what you have to imagine in order for these accusations to be true. And I just can't see that you would think that of any of these people, certainly Eastman, not even Trump, unless you already were sort of just completely sold on this like spy movie, basically, that they've got playing in their heads.
Yeah, and I saw somewhere else. Now, I mean, when the indictment came down, like as a joke, I was just saying to my friends, like, we mustn't let Trump weaponize the indictment by letting him put forward a defense where he repeats his lies. But that does seem to be actually like, behind a lot of the head scratching that you see in the New York Times. I mean, they seem to be like, well, how can we proceed if he's going to be allowed to relitigate the 2020 election? I mean, I think I saw one place they were saying Trump's tweets saying be peaceful and let's peacefully walk down the street. That's an indication. I mean, it's kind of Straussian.
Like, wink, wink. Yeah,
yes,
right.
It's an indication like, oh, yes, peaceful, but really what he meant was because he knew it would be violent. So even before anything happened, he was
like covering his bases.
Yes. And signaling to everyone the opposite of what he was saying. Right. So it's an extraordinarily perverse narrative.
Yeah, the other one of these is like he can't attack Pence in the presidential runoff because that's intimidating a witness, because Pence is going to become a witness in this case probably. And so now his like future political speech is kind of cabined in by his nefarious intent to defend, all the secret.
Right. Well, is that what the injunction that they just laid down the other day was, that he can't talk about anything?
Right. It's like even his efforts to secure the presidency by legal means, namely getting elected, are part of this scheme to, legitimize his coup. Well, okay, so this is all like we were talking about how if we allow ourselves, we'll just end up quoting Girard back and forth at each other hours on end. So we should probably talk about some of our other topics, but this is all incredibly interesting. And I have to say, the most charitable reading of all of this that I can give is you're dealing with a set of with a story that has now gone so deep that they can't even really see the extent to which it's confected.
Yes,
But
you know what Trump should say? He should say, "Forgive them, America. They know not what they
Oh my gosh. All right. Now we really have this. I swore I would never compare Trump to Jesus. Oh boy. Okay, let's talk about Hillary Clinton and the weaponization of loneliness. This is changing gears a little bit, but we've been noticing lately that the it's hard exactly to describe how this is working, but it seems that the people who work at our legacy media outlets and also the mainstream politicians who are least in touch with kind of current year American discourse have suddenly figured out that American men are not entirely satisfied with the state of gender politics and sexual relations and with the offerings of the global American empire. And so they're writing all of these articles like, have you guys heard of this Bronze Age pervert guy? Like both Politico and The Atlantic ran these long pieces saying there's a man online who calls himself Bronze Age pervert, and his followers speak in this funny way, and they lift weights and they talk about how democracy is maybe not the best, and they've really just turned into this terrible militia, this this infantry of young disaffected men. And mostly I want to talk with you, Seth, about why this is suddenly happening now, since for those of us that follow these issues and have an interest and a degree of curiosity about what people are saying that goes beyond just like disqualifying it as hateful. I mean, we've known about this stuff forever. It's been like pretty obvious. Mike Anton published a review of Bronze Age mindset in the CRB in like 2019. But we also wanted to bring in, I wanted to bring in this essay by Hillary Clinton in The Atlantic, The Weaponization of Loneliness. This is an article which uses the phrase vast right-wing conspiracy unironically. It is an essay that identifies the trends first really, famously chronicled by Robert Putnam, that the American social life is kind of disintegrating, identifies this exclusively with Steve Bannon, Rush Limbaugh, and the incel army that's coming to, I don't know, overthrow the government or something. Clinton seems to feel that the antidote to loneliness is for us all to gather in coffee shops and lobby in support of workers' unions. But it's really remarkable to me that a figure like Hillary Clinton, who was, in serious contention for president of the United States, is now kind of reduced to the role of sideline commentator about trends that are obvious to anyone with eyes to see on the internet. And I guess my question is like, why is this suddenly becoming a narrative now? Is it really that nobody has, nobody in the elite halls of our best journalistic institutions has ever thought about Bronze Age pervert and incels, or is there something going on here that's like wrapped up in the lead up to 2024?
Well, it's a really good question, and I haven't given it an intense amount of thought, but I did read over Hillary Clinton's piece, which was filled with all kinds of gems. It really seems like her mind is stuck in like the first Clinton presidency. But it seems like what her solution is everybody needs to go back and get their copy of It Takes a Village.
Yes.
Reread it and embrace it. And I guess it's kind of like she's calling for a return to the Longhouse values of the first Clinton administration. Maybe she's a little perturbed, as are her boomerish followers, by all of this neo-masculinity, embodied by Bronze Age pervert, or as we were talking earlier, someone like Andrew Tate. And
Right.
she's saying we need to like reassert the feminization of America, which has only been 98% effective. Like, what
Hmm.
happened? How did we manage to miss a few flickering coals of masculinity
Hmm.
and not douse them? Like, let's restore the complete gynarchy. That's the feeling I got from her piece. I mean, I thought it was really uh, rather rich to blame the right for uh,
For
increasing,
attenuating American communities. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and for the sense of loneliness. I mean, what is like diversity talk? I mean, their obsession is with dividing America into as many intersected segments as they can.
Yeah, I
Uh,
remember when Rush Limbaugh announced on air that we were gonna abandon the Rust Belt, convince women to leave churches and never get married. I remember when Steve Bannon said, everybody treat one another according to the color of their skin, divide the electorate up into micro demographics and turn them against one another. Yeah, I totally remember when the right destroyed communities in
yes,
America, a really sinister
and
right wing conspiracy.
like she keeps talking about VFW halls and how
Right.
why aren't there more people in VFW halls and churches and all of these places that the right wing has just been virtually like shutting down,
Yeah.
protesting outside. I mean, what is she talking about? It doesn't make any sense.
I mean, it's interesting that the name Andrew Tate does not appear in this article, and actually neither does Bronze Age pervert,
No,
despite the recent attention that has been paid. But he's certainly like It's almost as if like she hasn't been online recently enough to know to mention Andrew Tate, and so instead she just talks about this passage. Bannon targeted quote incels or involuntary celibate men. Like she's speaking to an audience that for whom it is like cutting edge news that there's a term called incel and that it refers to, she doesn't even really explain what it refers to. She just says involuntarily celibate men because they were easy to manipulate and prone to believing conspiracy theories. Why might that be? Why would people who define themselves as involuntarily celibate be, in Hillary Clinton's eyes, easy to manipulate? It's taken as read in this article simply that they are. You can activate this. He goes on with this quote. You can activate the army, Bannon told the Bloomberg journalist Joshua Green. They come in through Gamergate or whatever, and then get turned on to politics and Trump. It's like there's just zero curiosity in this piece about you know what kind of complicity the left might have had in creating the situation where men feel disaffected and disconnected from their community, why it is that involuntary celibacy might have a relationship to Donald Trump or to Gamergate. Like, if she explains what Gamergate is in this piece, I missed it. In any case, the whole
no,
notion,
she didn't at all. She
right?
just skipped over it.
No. It's just like these are all just kind of words, socially isolated gamers into shock troops of the alt right. You know, you want to know how you get Andrew Tate. You want to know how people become starved enough for models of manhood that they go running to a literal pimp. It's like you live in a world where the supposedly most, one of the most prestigious magazines in the country is publishing upwards of 3,000 words about the phenomenon of disaffected men and broken communities without ever once inquiring into, what are the actual discontents at stake here. And
Well,
of course, yeah, go on.
this goes back to the old deplorable thing. It's
Right.
not worth mentioning.
Yeah.
These people just have to be brought to heel, as she also said years
Yeah.
ago, in a different context. That's what she doesn't really. They don't really care what these people's. They're just clingers, right? They cling to guns and Bibles, and to what they think is their lost way of life, or the incels to this sense of grievance
Right.
that they have the right to women's bodies.
Right. I mean,
So
you know what this
why mention it?
the irony is, like, what this article really represents is a picture perfect demonstration of the friend enemy distinction. Like, that is the sole operative principle behind this essay, is that by definition, incels, gamergaters, Steve Bannon, Andrew Tate, if she had read enough to know who he is or like ever walked outside of her door, all of these people are the villains precisely because I am the object of their concerns and
Yeah,
accusations, right? It's because
yeah.
it's like these are the people who don't like Hillary Clinton and what Hillary Clinton stands for, and therefore ipso facto they are the problem. And whatever else is going on, we have to arrange society so that they're never heard from again.
And she gives away the game at the very end of the piece where she's talking about how the Surgeon General, what's his name, Murty, I can't remember his name. Yes, Murty. He says that loneliness is a health crisis, of course, because what isn't?
Mm-hmm.
But that he believes that there have to be. He has also called for stronger and more sophisticated oversight and regulation of tech companies. Which I think from her perspective just means allowing the government to say what they can post and what they can't post.
Yeah, it means overturning Missouri v. Biden, basically.
Yeah,
that's what
right.
that means.
Yeah, exactly. So I kind of feel like that's the core message, that it's a matter of health, it's a matter of safety and keeping kids safe and healthy. Those great bywords. So I think it's a particularly clumsy effort, Hillary's piece. I mean, it's so bad she actually may have written it herself.
Wow, that's too far. That's going too far. I do want to ask though, on the other side of this, like the whole Tate phenomenon, because interestingly, it's not just clueless lefty journos who are suddenly discovering the rise of Bronze Age pervert. And it is remarkable that they think like we don't know about these people unless they explain them to us. Like the whole game just smacks of, what year was It Takes a Village published? Like 1996 or something. It just all smacks of like 1996 political scenario when the Atlantic really was like sort of the magazine of record, and people didn't really know about stuff unless they heard about it in the Times, and this was the cutting edge of trends in America. And so now we're gonna reveal to you that there are incels and they do Gamergate, and that's bad. Like, go against the bad people. On the other side of this, there does actually seem to be, we've just ran a piece about this. Like, Andrew Tate is suddenly sort of everywhere. He's on Tucker, he's on Candace, he's getting interviewed at all these different venues. Like, apparently he has a brother who's suddenly in all of these venues. Is this just like signs of starvation? Is this just people are so desperate for a role model and a man and all this stuff that they'll take like anybody that looks remotely plausible?
I admit I am baffled by the Tate phenomenon and why anyone would be taken in by this. He's so like ostentatiously horrible and egregious.
Right.
I can't even imagine if you were like, I don't know, like 19 years old. I mean, maybe maybe if you were 14 years old, you would think it was cool. But I mean, he just seems patently horrible. Maybe I'm too old to like really get it. But yeah, I don't understand why he's being platform. I mean, except for the obvious reason that he has a big following, so people watch it. But why conservatives like talk to him as though he's a thinker, as opposed? I think his philosophy is that of like a gangster rapper, or like one of those guys. MTV used to have this show, like, I don't know, Pimps Up, Hose Down, or something.
Yeah.
The people that would be at like the pimp convention. I mean,
Yeah, it's like, and now now we'll hear from Dr. Dre with a PhD in like
I
in
mean,
smacking. Yeah, right.
Dr. Dre is a lot more like kind of at least has some. He
Like
seems like he
wry
has
and
some
articulate.
perspective on
Yeah.
things other than just like smacking women in the face if they talk back to you.
I
I don't
mean,
really get it. I do not get it.
yeah, I have to say a lot of it just, has the whiff of desperation to me. It's certainly true that no one really quite knows, how to represent modern manhood in a way that is like virtuous but also cool. And I shouldn't say nobody, because there are, really good accounts out there that deal with this, but there's this constant full frontal assault on masculinity, as you just indicated. And then in order to smack to clap back against that or whatever, you have to sort of put yourself forward as a model of manhood, which is itself kind of an inherently unmanly thing to do. Like it's sort of
That's
um
right.
feminized behavior to be like, look at me, look
Yes.
at all my practices. And so then like all of these offerings kind of don't satisfy, or they're obviously fake and cringe a little bit. And so you end up in this impossible position, and then somebody like Tate comes along who has, so far as I can tell, like no internal editor, like no self-awareness to say, well, I actually feel like kind of a dork up here, flexing on my Lamborghini or whatever. And conservatives perennially, we did this with Kanye West too. It's like anybody with even an ounce of style or presentation or following or cool or or self presentation will just we're so desperate for somebody like that to like us and to have some kind of like
Uh-huh.
cool kid on our team or
Uh-huh.
whatever, that will just be like, yes, now we will hear from Professor Andrew Tate, like, on his work in the field of pimp studies. Like,
You know what's funny, and it was a little bit poignant when I heard him say this.
mm,
Andrew Tate's background is, I guess, his mother is like a white English woman, and his father is a black guy from Chicago. His father was like a chess champion of some sort, like a
mm,
legitimate chess grandmaster. I don't know, but Tate grew up largely in England. And I remember one time I saw him saying that he would only see his father for like one day a year. But
right.
what he said is, my father was such a great dad that he fathered me more than like just that one day a year was all the fathering like
Mm,
any boy could take. And it's obviously just total cope.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like
It's like it's like talking to an abandoned 8-year-old about his
yes,
dad that went out for cigarettes. Like, he's
yes,
totally
and
gonna
like,
come back.
oh,
Yeah.
but my dad, he's going to bring me back like so many great toys.
Yeah.
So it just seemed kind of like sad, and then you kind of understand why he's got this front. Um, and then I guess recently he converted to Islam,
Yeah.
and but that didn't seem to. I mean, it kind of seemed like, well, if you convert to anything, presumably there's some repentance involved, and then like a turning away from what you did, right? I mean, isn't that
Oh
usually?
yeah, subhanallah, it's in the Quran that you go out and like film women without their consent, as I recall. No, I mean, yeah,
Right.
yeah.
So I mean,
I missed that part. I missed that verse.
it
Yeah.
didn't seem like he changed at all. He was just back in like Romania, like running his Camhor harem, and the rest of it. Like I didn't see. I mean, I'm not going to say he's not a whatever. I mean, if he converted to Islam, he converted to Islam, but I didn't see any outward evidence of repentance or turning. Right,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I
turning
mean,
away.
you're so smart to bring up the dad thing, because I think that not only explains his demeanor and his own kind of very visible to me inner woundedness, but it also explains the crucial connection with his audience. That we
Mm.
never talk about that in this context. But fatherless boys will recognize a fatherless man and will empathize with him and kind of find a role model, because like the real crisis of masculinity is a crisis of fatherlessness. Like, there's no
I mean,
separating those two things.
America leads the world in single parent households.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that amazing? Nobody cites that. Like, the left likes to talk about all the ways in which,
Hmm.
the US is even lower than Haiti or Liberia in terms of maternal health or whatever. But the fact that America leads the world,
Yeah.
number one, by far, in
Hmm.
single parent households and, just single parenthood and so forth, just strikes me as like an astounding. I mean, I think among blacks, it's like 70% of births
Oh,
end up
yeah.
with women. And among whites, it's growing rapidly. I think it's up to 40% or something. I guess maybe Andrew Tate's the future. I don't know.
Oof. I mean, this is an urgent conversation because, we just saw that poll that Gen Z boys are trending conservative, high school kids, and all the reasons why are obvious to see for anybody except for Hillary Clinton. Like if your name is not Hillary Clinton, you can see why boys would be becoming more conservative. They've grown up in the wreckage of a once great nation, essentially, and a once great culture. They're looking around them at at a country that to them has never really delivered the kind of inspiration and models that they need to grow up, and they're like looking for a positive vision, an edifying vision of the world. So of course they're trending conservative, but I suspect they're going to be pissed. These are the kids that lived through COVID. These are the kids that watched us stumble out of Afghanistan, like all of this stuff. And these are the kids that grew up in the Longhouse, essentially. And so they are totally gonna respond to anybody, good or bad, who promises to like lead that and channel that anger and all of that legitimate frustration in many cases. And the fatherlessness thing, I've just been reading this book by Ian McGilchrist called The Matter with Things, and it's he's a neuroscientist, but he cites a bunch of other people from other disciplines. And one of the things he talks about is this concept of the science colored glasses. I think it's James Flynn who came up with this, that there are certain effects that we can't even see or measure in our brain scans because we only know how to establish metrics that test for scientific intelligence. And so, Flynn came up with this observation that IQ is increasing, but he subsequently pointed out that IQ and all these other tests have this kind of fatal flaw that they're conditioned by a hyper scientistic idea of what counts as success, as intelligence, as insight, and all this stuff. A lot of which is not even the whole of what goes into scientific innovation. My reason for bringing all this up is just to say, like, that measure of fatherlessness, whenever you hear somebody say, well, America lags behind the developed countries, they're always the ones picking the metric the standard that they measure us by. And, if you spoke to like, a Germanic tribesman or a medieval cleric, that would be the measurement that they would point to and say, you guys are savages. Like you're living in a nation full of abandoned women and children, essentially. And that's what makes you cavemen. It's not your like inadequate healthcare systems or whatever.
Yeah, it's scary to think about a nation of fatherless boys,
Yeah.
hungry for leadership.
Yeah.
I mean, this is exactly what the left. I mean, it sounds like German Freikorps type stuff, right?
Mm.
Like, from the 20s or 30s.
I just did Control F on Hillary's article. The word father is another word that does not appear in this essay, which is very telling. So there you go.
Yes, indeed. That says it all.
Yeah, yeah. And mother appears only once to just refer to somebody, a character in a story. Okay, this was really interesting, Seth. We should just briefly touch on this secret Chinese lab because we're gonna run a whole feature about this and other China related matters. But you brought to our attention this story from California. Jesselyn Harper, the city of Reedley's code enforcement officer, was investigating a business that she thought was not up to code. And she kind of stumbles upon this enormous lab and being run by a company whose owners live in China, Prestige Biotech Inc. They were using the building near Reedley's downtown for storing and shipping an array of diagnostic test kits for COVID-19, pregnancy, drugs, and more after apparently being booted out of their Fresno location in late 2022 by their landlord. The inventory of biological agents in the refrigerators include coronavirus and other exotic contagions, such as malaria, hepatitis B and C, chlamydia, human herpes, and rubella, among others, used in the production of various test kits. That is an amazing paragraph. And the most amazing part is this is a story in the Sacramento Bee. Like,
Yeah,
have you
yeah,
seen
yeah.
this report anywhere else?
No, no, no. And if you look it up, it's only in like local, you know, Fresno, Sacramento area publications and news. Um, I mean, I gather also there were like 1,000 mice, I believe, like many of them were dead that had been infected with various things, and they were like they were developed, they were working on COVID, and so it's a Nevada-based company owned by Chinese, and I guess the mayor of really wherever this place is was saying like, well, I guess because it's a private lab, like there's no oversight over it. I mean, this just seems so crazy to me. And I mean, I was thinking like, could we go to China and set up our own lab and just start producing coronavirus there? And I mean, the
Oh, we
reason,
couldn't even go to China and like find our way on the subway to the wet market. Like this,
right?
please, perish the thought.
And the code inspector like walked by and she saw there was like a hose sticking into a window, like a
Right.
garden hose. I mean, it just seemed like completely. It had been shut down, but now apparently they're good. They want to reopen in Fresno. They're like, oh yeah, yeah, we're taking care of the code violation.
Oh, right. Yeah. Thank goodness. I'm so reassured.
And
This
the
is
people in Fresno are like, wait a second, hold on, do we really want this business back here? And it's like, well, I don't know if we can do anything about it.
it's so crazy that it never even occurs. Like this is the, I mean, this is the kind of brain dead mentality of, sort of market fundamentalism, among other things, right? It's like, oh, you're not like following our regulations, but once you do, like you'll be spick and span, like just follow the rules and whatever you're doing. I mean,
Yeah.
it reminds me of like the opening scene of a Resident Evil movie or video game where it's like, the Umbrella Corporation, they sure do sell a lot of nice drugs, but I wonder what they're doing. Oh my God, it's a zombie. Like that's
Yeah,
kind
I
of
mean,
what this looks like.
this is a side, but in New York City, there's been, I think, 15 deaths in the last year. So, I mean, a lot associated
Mm.
with exploding lithium ion batteries that delivery men use in their bikes, their e-bikes, to zip around. And then they, a whole secondary business has sprung up of charging these batteries.
Mm.
Like people do it inside like public housing projects or just storefronts, but they're really shoddy batteries and they overload the system. And then they explode, there's fires. And these are all off label or just off brand batteries. But I seem to remember it used to be that America like kind of had strict standards about things like consumer electronics. Like you couldn't just, it wasn't the case that like whatever a Chinese factory could produce, we were obligated to sell.
Do
But
you
that's the way America
remember?
is now.
Oh, do you remember that glowing piece that some rag published about the brave trans women who were conducting surgeries in a shack? That this was like earlier, it was like less than a calendar year ago. And I'll see if I can pull up the piece we put in the show notes or something. But it was just this, sort of this warm, inspiring article about how these guys had basically like, former nurse or whatever had like got a bunch of off licensed medical equipment and was just like they were just like hacking body parts off in the middle of the woods. It was like something out of a horror movie. And it was like, oh, this is so inspiring. Yeah, the whole thing, among other things, does sort of it screams managed decline, and I'm sure that the Chinese
Yeah, or
are laughing their way to the bank.
not to mention fentanyl, which I think we talked about last time.
Yeah.
You know, why are we just the sump of Chinese industry? Like it's essentially like we're just taking all their waste product. It's so insane, and I don't know. That's why I like that piece. It just seemed so weird.
I wonder if this can be connected to the kind of maximalist attitude about immigration that you see now, where it's just like America is just kind of a dumping ground. Like it
Yes,
doesn't have a local culture or populace, and
nothing.
it doesn't deserve one. It's just this sort of big, empty vessel full of resources for
Yeah,
like virtuous foreigners to
it's
like
like
pick over.
it's like one of the sink ports,
Yeah, yeah.
like a free trade zone, or like some kind of. It's just a giant entrepot.
Yeah.
A like
Yeah.
Beirut or Singapore or something. Some crazy version of that, and where people just hang their hat, trade, and then go back to their regular homes, or not, or just stay here. It's really like, oh, we like what you've done with the place.
Right. Yeah, we'll take that now. It's the same mentality that runs those articles about like white people have no culture or, British culture is stolen from all these other places. Like like we are the great void, the great neutral that everybody else gets to sort of like suck the marrow out of. Okay. We will, as I said, be running some more stuff about Chinese interference and subterfuge in the weeks and months to come. But for now, it is time to remind you to read the damn site. If you are just happening upon this podcast for the first time, very glad you're here. You will be thrilled, I'm sure, to learn that we don't just get on the phone and chat every Wednesday. We also run a website. It's called AmericanMind.org, and we like to pick out pieces that we have found particularly interesting each week to recommend to you. Mine this week is called Why Affirmative Action Won't Die. It's by Jesse Merriam, who's one of our Claremont scholars at the DC Center. He's also an associate professor at Patrick Henry College. There's obviously been a lot written about the Supreme Court's decision in Students for Fair Admissions v. Harvard College and Student for Fair Admissions v. University of North Carolina, this sort of joint case that ended up officially, at least, striking down um, affirmative action in college admissions. And Jesse wrote before this decision came down in CRB about what was likely to happen, what wasn't likely to happen. Now he's written for us after the decision to sort of describe the ways in which affirmative action as a regime will continue on, in part because it is already embedded in the small c constitution. As I understand him, Jesse is arguing that this whole mentality, the attitude of diversity is our strength, may have begun with the civil rights movement and with and with Lyndon Johnson's executive order, but it has gone far beyond that and now represents a rival constitutional scheme. It's culturally ingrained in many of these institutions. It's legally defended, or at least if you don't admit that you're doing it, you can contrive a very good legal defense. And so this piece just goes into great detail about this with the acumen of a scholar, and it's under 2,000 words, very readable, pretty brief. Why Affirmative Action Won't Die by Jesse Merriam. And if you like that piece, the new issue of CRB has a bunch of great stuff also about this decision from Bill Vogley and Chris Caldwell. Lots to recommend there. Seth, what do you got?
I mean, I know this is a little pleonastic of our earlier segment, but Michael Robillard has a piece called "In Tate We Trust"
Mm-hmm.
About the Andrew Tate phenomenon. I sort of probably stole a bunch of his views for my little rant, but it's an interesting piece looking at the Tate phenomenon and inquiring into why this, pimp and materialist has become a hero, and why it's not going to following him will not break us out of the matrix, but as he says, only shackle Western men to sexual vice and consumerism, deracinate and atomize them, and thereby strengthen the present world regime. under the false pretense of undermining it, which I think is a very good point to make. You have to be careful when you're trying to exit the longhouse that you don't just extend it.
Many of the doors that purport to free you will only lead you deeper in. Yeah, that was a great point of, I think it's Robillard, maybe Robillard, I'm not sure, but he's a new author for us, and that piece is really good. In Tate We Trust, up on the front page. In fact, right now as we speak. Okay, that's AmericanMind.org, and if you want to explore further in the Claremont extended universe, we've got you covered. There are all sorts of places you can go. ClaremontReviewBooks.com is where you will find the CRB, our quarterly review of books. There's a lot of great stuff coming out in that publication very, very shortly. We're about to put out our summer issue. It's sometimes we run an issue and I'm proofreading the whole thing and reading it all over one last time. And I just think, man, this is a particularly good one. This is one of those issues. It's chock full of excellent stuff. So you won't want to miss it. Subscribe before we put it out so that you will get it in the mail, ClaremontReviewBooks.com. And check out our DC-based Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. That's what Jesse is affiliated with, Jesse Merriam, whom I mentioned earlier. You can donate to support our work, for which we would be most grateful at claremont.org/donate. And we will shout you out on the show if you ask us to, although many of our donors like to remain anonymous, and we're very happy with that. Finally, if you like this show, it really goes a long way to give it 5 stars, to subscribe wherever you're listening, to share it online, to share it offline with your friends. Come join the party and invite others to do as well. That really helps us, and we love talking to you. So please join us. That's it for this week. Thanks to our production crew, Jake Gannon and Logan Zeppieri, and thanks to you all for listening. We will talk to you next week.